Hello and welcome to the C++11 Beginner Tutorials by Gamer2Creator. I'm Chris. So it's time to talk about function parameters. We haven't used any yet, but they are a very powerful and important concept to understand. So far I've just deleted most of the code from the main function. I left our two function calls to get a random number because we may need these. So what are function parameters? Well, let's write a simple function. It'll take in an int, it'll return an int, and it'll take in two ints, multiply them together, and return the result. So I've made this function take in two parameters. Both of them are integers, and you put parameters between the parentheses. Now, if I didn't have any parameters here, this function wouldn't know what to multiply. There's no information. How do you tell it what to multiply? Well, you can pass in the parameters first and second. And again, you can name these whatever you want. I'm naming them first and second, just for fun. Makes sense to me. So it does what I said it would. It multiplies first and second and returns a result. Now we can call this function down here. Just like this. And we send it in the integer 10 and the integer 101. We can even count the return value and it should print out 1010. So what happened here is that we got to this line, we called this function, and we sent it this information, two parameters. Now what you send it must match what it's declared as in the parameter list. We must send it an integer and another integer. For example, if I had an employee, I couldn't just put an imp in here. That makes no sense. This function was not designed to take in an employee. And it can't convert an employee to an integer either. So we can do it like this. We can declare our variables int, x equals 10, and int y equals 1111. And then we pass x and y. And it should print out 11,110. So, in the last lesson we talked about scope. And this is important because now it comes into play. This x and y are destroyed here at the end of the function. Now, in this function, the parameters take in a first and a second. These are copies of the x and y that we send in, and they are declared within this scope. So these are their own variables. They exist in their own places in memory, and they are independent from the variables that we sent in. And they will be destroyed. This first and this second will be destroyed at the end of this function. And we can see this happening. We go through line by line. Step over, step over. Now we're going to step into it. As you can see, we have the locals within this function of first and second. And this is the only place that they exist. As we step over and step over, and we jump back out, as you can see here in the locals, excuse me, first and second do not exist anymore. However, the return value from the statement, or from the function, does. So it's as if we replace this with the value it returned. Now, we can do more interesting stuff than just using ints. Since this is object-oriented programming, we can return an employee. And we'll call it, I don't know, check age. Check salary. We'll do this. But we can also send in employee. Any type that you can create. And I misspelled it. Any type that you've created in a class can be used as parameters, just like an integer or a float. Let's make a float version real quick just to prove that. And as you can see here, I'm going to change this name. We haven't got into that yet. As you can see here, we have written a function that takes in ints, returns ints. We've wrote a function that takes in floats, and returns floats, and we also have a function that takes in an employee and returns an employee. Now we can modify our emp. We can say if emp dot, and this is just an example, if salary is less than, let's say, 20,000, then we're going to give this guy a raise. Emp dot salary is equal to 25,000. So, and then it returns it. So it's a very simple thing that we check if his salary is low, below 20,000. Then we're going to give him a raise to 25,000. And then we return our employee. Now remember that this employee has been copied. It only exists in here. And then the return value returns another copy of it back outside of the function to the calling location. So let's try this. If we wanted to make a change to an employee like this within a function, we first have our employee, and now we need to set up some default values for our employee. And we're going to use the function that we wrote earlier. Since we don't have to write this all over again, it saves us a lot of time, and that's one reason for functions existing. Now that our employee is set up, we can check his salary, send our employee in. So far, we've called this function, we've sent our employee in, but knowing that it's a copy within this function, and the only way that we can get information back out of what happens in here is the return. So it returns a new employee with the changes that we made. So we need to reassign this. And now our changes should stick. Now, here's another good opportunity to write another function that takes in an employee. Here we have a function that gets an employee from the console. Now we're going to write a function that prints an employee to the console. and it takes in an employee. So after we write this, then we'll never have to worry about printing it to the console again. And we're going to add in first. We'll copy that. Last age salary. And since this returns void, we don't need a return statement. So this simply takes in an employee and prints its information. Now after we've checked the salary and changed it if it's too low, we can print it back out. Print employee console. So let's see if this works. Stop our last program and we'll run it. So right now we're doing this function, get employee from console. So it's asking me for first name. 7, say a generous 50,000, and then it prints it out. So most of our code now, we don't have to write much code now. This would have been a lot of code, but instead we're just calling functions that do particular tasks, and we're able to pass into those functions our data, our employees, and our integers, and whatever other types that we want to pass in. And this is how you use functions properly. And this is why it saves you a lot of work, because we can now print any employee out as many times as we want, whenever we want, with just this line of code. So let's go through and make sure that our check salary function is working. I'm going to say, Kobe Bryant. I think he's 34. And we're going to pretend like he makes $19,000 a year. So when we print it back out, you can see that our data has changed. He was making $19,000 a year, but because we used our check salary function, it changed it to $25,000 a year. Now soon, maybe not in the next video, but we're getting to the point where we can start talking about references and pointers. And this is using these are a way to get around the default behavior of copying. Because here we have created our copy of our employee. You don't always want this behavior. Sometimes you want to send in this particular employee and change that employee's data and not have to return that particular employee or a new employee and assign it again like we did here. That may have sounded complicated, but we'll get into it and we'll break it down. Now I suggest that you practice. Write a lot of code, write your functions, write your classes, pass them around, get used to how things work, and it'll start to sink in.